When 23-year-old Juri Kibuishi walked into a room, you couldn't help but notice her. Just 5 foot 3 inches tall, beautiful and outgoing, Juri, whose Americanized name was Julie, had a freewheeling personality and instinctive kindness that just drew people to her. From the flowers that she often pinned in her dark hair to her dramatic eyeliner and colorful painted fingernails, Julie looked like what she was, creative and unconventional. Despite their much more proper and low-key appearance, Julie's Japanese-born parents had always encouraged their daughter's artistic pursuits. And when Julie, a lifelong resident of Irvine, California, was high school-aged, she was accepted into the prestigious Orange County School for the Arts. This was a highly selective charter school that catered to students who were especially interested in the visual and performing arts. But Julie's parents had also stressed the importance to all 4 of their children of getting excellent grades. So even as Julie spent 5 years studying dance and becoming a gifted and passionate performer, she also applied herself with just as much energy to her college preparatory courses. Julie's goal after high school was to dance and to eventually get a degree in fashion design. She found just the program she wanted at Orange Coast College in Costa Mesa, California, one of the top transfer community colleges in the country, and just a 30-minute drive from Irvine, California, where Julie lived with her parents. At Orange Coast, Julie could get her associate's degree and start work in fashion right away, and then if she wanted to, she could transfer to a 4-year college. She would also have time to take dance classes and keep performing. Located 37 miles south of Los Angeles, Costa Mesa is a busy commercial city about a mile from the Pacific coast. Not nearly as expensive as Los Angeles, Costa Mesa was a magnet for aspiring actors and artists and writers who hoped to make their way into some aspect of show business, whether it was movies, the stage, dancing, or scriptwriting. Julie loved the creative energy at Orange Coast, and she also loved all the different types of people who are drawn to a community college, from older students with day jobs to younger students like herself. One of these students was 26-year-old Samuel Herr, an Army veteran whose military service included 15 months in a remote and dangerous outpost in Afghanistan. 5 foot 10 inches tall and 200 pounds, Sam had movie star good looks and an outgoing personality. An only child of older parents, Sam's father had served in the Marines, and like his father, Sam had also found purpose, meaning, and self-discipline during his time in the military. Sam's fellow soldiers described him as courageous and funny. The women he served with described him as very professional and chivalrous. In 2010, after his Army enlistment ended, Sam had also enrolled in Orange Coast College in Costa Mesa. This was the first step in his plan to earn the college degree that he needed in order to re-enter the military as an officer. Although Julie and Sam came from very different backgrounds, as soon as they met each other in an anthropology class, they totally hit it off. Not in a romantic sense, each of them had serious, long-distance relationships with other people, but as friends. Both of them were very close with their families, they enjoyed socializing, and they both had the same outgoing personalities and the same slightly goofy sense of humor and fun. They also both liked tattoos. Julie had 7 of them, and Sam had ink on both arms as well as a huge heart inscribed with Mom and Dad tattooed on his chest. But on a deeper level, Sam and Julie were also both very serious about getting good grades in college and ultimately achieving their long-term career goals. So as soon as Julie realized that her classmate Sam was struggling in their anthropology class, she offered to help tutor him. One evening, when Sam's parents stopped by their son's apartment and met Julie, who was there helping Sam with his homework, they were both struck by the easy friendship between their son and Julie. And when Julie would go on to describe Sam to her parents, she would say they were just friends. One of the nice things for both of them about being in a strictly platonic relationship was being able to talk to one another about their romantic partners. Julie was in an online relationship with a Marine corporal named Mark, who was stationed in Okinawa, Japan, and Sam was engaged to a German woman named Katerina, whom he had met while he was in the service. Sam also felt comfortable opening up to Julie about his combat experience in Afghanistan and the night terrors that he had brought home with him. As their friendship grew, Julie began spending more time with Sam outside of just tutoring, and one thing they both liked to do together was spend time with the group of young people who often gathered in the evenings and on the weekends outside of the large apartment complex where Sam lived. For Sam, the Camden Martinique Apartments, which is where he lived, were the perfect location. It was less than a half mile from Orange Coast College and only a 30-minute drive from where his parents lived in Anaheim Hills. The rent wasn't cheap, but Sam had always been very careful with money, and he had saved $62,000 in combat pay that he had earned while he was serving in Afghanistan. Among the big group of young people who hung out together at the apartment's pool and outdoor patios, there was one couple in particular that Julie and Sam got to know pretty well. 26-year-old actor Daniel Wozniak and his fiancée, 23-year-old actress Rachel Buffett. Like a lot of actors, Dan and Rachel struggled to make ends meet, even as they dreamed of breaking into the Los Angeles acting scene. Rachel, who was small with delicate features and long blonde hair, still looked the part of the Disney princess she once played at Disneyland when she was a teenager. Dan, who was a big guy, had an easy smile, thick dark hair, good looks, and a booming voice that helped him land lead roles in the community theaters where he and Rachel often starred opposite one another. Usually dressed in khaki shorts or pants and Hawaiian shirts with bright prints, Dan never felt more at home or more genuinely himself than when he was on stage. In the spring of 2010, when Julie and Sam met Dan and Rachel, Rachel was busy planning the couple's wedding. After a 2-year-long engagement, the big date was finally just weeks away, May 28th, and afterward the couple would go to Mexico for their honeymoon. On Friday, May 21st, just a week before Dan and Rachel were going to get married, Julie had a date with her older brother, Taka, at a Thai restaurant in Long Beach to talk about his wedding. Taka also had a surprise for his younger sister. He and his fiancée wanted Julie to be a bridesmaid at their wedding, and that night at dinner, Taka handed Julie the tiara that she would be wearing on Taka's big day. Julie was thrilled, but she was also feeling a little distracted and worried. Throughout that afternoon and evening, Julie had started to receive a series of very strange text messages from her friend Sam. He sounded upset, and he told her he needed to talk to someone. In what she thought must be a bad attempt at humor, he wrote, "No sex. Can you come over tonight at around midnight? Just talk, don't tell anyone. Going out for a little now. Some bad family stuff." Julie was puzzled. Like her, Sam seemed to get along with his mother and father really well. In fact, she thought he was supposed to be visiting with them in Anaheim that weekend. Julie told her brother about these weird messages she was getting. Taka asked her if this was normal for Sam, and she said no, but Sam had been through a lot. Noticing her brother looking concerned, Julie looked up from her phone and smiled at him and said, "Don't worry, you'd like Sam." After dinner, Julie said goodbye to her brother, and laughing, she put the tiara on just before stepping out into the clear 60-degree evening. She could feel the light breeze from the ocean as she climbed into her car to make the 35-minute drive south from Long Beach to the Camden Martinique Apartments where Sam was. The following morning, Julie's mother, June, looked down the bedroom hallway of their house and noticed the door to her daughter's bedroom was open. Peeking inside, she saw Julie was not in there, and she realized in that moment that her daughter had not come home the night before. June immediately called and texted Julie, but received no answer. When she called her son Taka to see if maybe Julie had stayed the night with him and his fiancée, June's worry deepened to alarm. Taka said no, Julie was not with them, and he told his mother about the very strange text messages that Julie had received from her friend Sam. Feeling very concerned, Taka and his mother began scrolling through their texts and contacts to see if they could find Sam's number. Meanwhile, about 20 miles away in Anaheim, Sam's parents had also begun worrying about their child. Sam was supposed to visit them that morning, but he hadn't shown up yet. Sam had always been good about letting his parents know if his plans had changed or if he was running late, but by midday, they still had not gotten a call or text from him. By late afternoon, Sam's father, Steve, who was an athletic-looking man with thick white hair who often went to the gym with his son, he hopped into his car and drove up to Costa Mesa to make sure Sam was okay. Once Steve arrived at the Camden Martinique Apartments, it was getting dark. He walked up the stairs to apartment D110 and knocked on the door. when he didn't hear an answer, Steve reached into his pocket and pulled out the spare apartment key that Sam had given him. He unlocked the door and he stepped inside. Turning on the light, Steve saw immediately that there was no one in the kitchen or living room, and also no sign of any disturbance. As he headed toward the bedroom, he hoped he'd find his son laid up in bed with a bad cold. Instead, as he pushed open the door to the bedroom and flipped on the wall light, it was like he had discovered a chamber of horrors. Kneeling next to the bed with her upper body lying stomach down on top of the mattress was the body of a young woman. Her jeans, which were cut or torn, had been pulled down almost to her knees. On the back of her sweater, scrawled in black magic marker, were the words, "All yours, F you." Although one side of the woman's face was visible, she was totally unrecognizable. Her features were covered in blood and gore, and all Steve could really see was just this massive wound above and behind her ear. It looked like the back of her head had been blown off. And just above that crater of bone, blood, and brain tissue, Steve saw a tiara tangled in a mass of blood-soaked hair. Shocked, Steve backed away from the gruesome scene, and after quickly checking the other rooms and finding no one else in the apartment, he pulled out his phone and he dialed 911. Near the doorway to the bedroom, police found a colorful shoulder bag. It contained a cell phone and a wallet with a driver's license. The victim, sprawled on the bed and the floor, was 23-year-old Julie Kibuishi. When they were informed by police that their daughter was dead, Julie's parents were devastated. June Hibuishi kept telling the officers they must have made a mistake. The evening before, she and her daughter had been cooking together in the kitchen. When it had been time for Julie to go see her brother at the restaurant, she had changed her clothes, given her mom a quick hug, said goodbye, and stepped out the door. It was impossible to June and her husband that this daughter, who was so kind and so full of life, could now just be dead. As for the Costa Mesa detectives who arrived on the scene moments after receiving Steve Herr's frantic 911 call, every piece of evidence they discovered inside of that apartment pointed to Steve's son, Sam. Sam knew the victim, and from the words written on the back of Julie's sweater and the position of her body that suggested sexual assault, she may have been caught up in a love triangle gone wrong, or been the victim of a domestic dispute with Sam. Most damning of all was the long string of strange text messages that Sam had sent Julie the night before, begging her to come see him immediately. And even though Sam said, quote, "no sex" in one of his text messages, just the mention of sex seemed to indicate that it was possible that these two were, in fact, romantically involved, despite what they told people. And then there was Sam's military background and his combat experience in Afghanistan, and the possibility that Sam, like many combat veterans, was affected by post-traumatic stress disorder. Maybe Sam had just snapped and killed Julie during an episode of combat-related psychosis. The cause of death appeared to be a single gunshot wound to Julie's head, and as a trained combat soldier, Sam would have known how to use a firearm. 24 hours later, when Sam still had not been located or heard from, the Costa Mesa police had found yet another reason to suspect he was their killer. After digging into Sam's background, detectives were stunned to discover that back in 2002, when Sam was 18 years old, he had been arrested and charged in connection with the murder of another teenager. Although Sam was eventually acquitted and cleared of all charges, he had been a serious suspect, and he had spent the better part of a year behind bars. The police wasted no time. They issued an all-points bulletin with Sam's picture and physical description plastered across the top of it. Meanwhile, however bad things looked for Sam, Steve Herr could not believe that his son killed Julie. Sam had been acquitted of all criminal charges related to that 2002 murder, and even after the trauma and stigma of spending months in jail, Sam had gone on to rebuild his life and reputation. He always had a steady job from that point forward, but it was when he enlisted in the army that he found his true sense of meaning and purpose. So while police launched a massive manhunt for the man they considered armed and dangerous, Sam's father started to do his own digging. If Sam was on the run, he would need money, and Steve shared a bank account with his son. Sure enough, when Steve accessed the shared account, he saw that every day since his disappearance, Sam had used his ATM card to make a series of large cash withdrawals. The trail led south to a bank of ATMs in Long Beach. The police had also tracked Sam's ATM card, and unlike Steve, they had access to the video surveillance at the ATMs. Looking at the camera footage, detectives expected to see the face of Sam Herr. Instead, the person seen using Sam's card was a teenage boy carrying a skateboard and wearing sunglasses and a hoodie. When the same ATM card was used to place a pizza order at a nearby pizza joint called Echoes, police were able to get the address of the house where the pizza would be delivered. They staked out that address, thinking that maybe Sam was hiding inside of the house. But when police, guns drawn, entered the house right alongside the pizza delivery person, the only people they found inside were the teenager they'd seen on the ATM surveillance tape and his mother. A terrified 16-year-old Wesley Freilich told police that he had been given the ATM card by a man he knew who was working for a bail bonds agent. The man had told Wesley that the card belonged to a client who had posted bond but then disappeared without paying the agent. According to Wesley, this man who had given him the ATM card was someone his mom knew through the community acting that she did. Wesley said he was a good guy and he trusted him when this guy outlined the plan with the ATM card. Wesley would make withdrawals every day of up to $400 and turn the money over to the man who would wait in his parked car some distance from each ATM machine. As payment for doing this, Wesley would be allowed to use this ATM card to order pizza for himself. The name of this mystery man was instantly familiar to police: 26-year-old actor Daniel Wozniak. Daniel and his fiancée Rachel, who were both friends with Sam and Julie, had been among the residents of the apartment complex that police had interviewed the day after Julie's body had been discovered. And in the course of that routine interview with them, Dan had told police that he and Rachel had last seen Sam on the afternoon of Friday, May 21st, which was the night Julie had dinner with her brother before going to see Sam. Daniel told police that he, Rachel, and Sam had chatted briefly that night, and then Sam had left the apartment complex with a man in a black hat who Dan did not recognize. After determining that the 16-year-old Wesley had no personal connection to Sam Herr, police decided to turn their attention back to Dan. The bail bondsman story just sounded like a total fabrication. They now suspected that Daniel might be helping Sam get money and that Dan might even be hiding or covering for his friend. But tracking down Dan for a second interview turned out to be much more difficult than the police expected. When they finally reached Dan on his cell phone and asked him to come into the Costa Mesa police station for another interview, Dan was evasive. He wanted to help, but he was busy. It was the final week of the play 9, in which he and Rachel had starring roles. They were also just days away from getting married, and when they weren't rehearsing or on stage, they were busy with last-minute wedding plans. Frustrated, detectives decided not to wait any longer. On the evening of May 25th, just 3 days after Julie's murder, detectives crashed Dan's bachelor party. They found Dan, dressed in his trademark khaki pants and Hawaiian shirt, at a suburban Japanese restaurant named Tsunami in Huntington Beach. Guns drawn, police entered through both the front and back doors. That way, no one could get out of the restaurant without being seen. At about 10 p.m., in front of his stunned group of friends, police snapped handcuffs on Dan and charged him with accessory to murder. Dan was completely shocked, and the color in his face just completely drained. But once Dan was inside the police station, his demeanor changed. He suddenly seemed somewhat composed and told police that he wanted to tell them what his real connection to Sam Herr was. Sitting in a plastic chair in the corner of the small interrogation room, Dan took a deep breath and then came clean. He told police that the whole bail bondsman thing that the 16-year-old kid was involved in was indeed a fabrication. It was a cover for a credit card scam that he and Sam were in on together. The way it worked was Wesley, the 16-year-old, would make a series of large cash withdrawals using Sam's bank cards, and then Sam would put in a claim with his bank saying he never authorized the withdrawals. This, of course, allowed Sam and Daniel to keep the cash Wesley had taken out, as well as the reimbursement money they would get from the bank. Wesley did not realize this was going on. He thought this was all legit, and he really was working for Daniel, who was working with a bail bondsman, and Wesley thought he was just getting some free pizza out of it. His mother was also unaware of this scam. The police proceeded to ask Daniel the same questions they had asked before when they spoke to him at the apartment, and Daniel gave the same answers. The last time he saw Sam was on that Friday afternoon, shortly before he saw him walk off with some guy in a black hat, and then that night, Daniel and his fiancée Rachel had been at their theater performing in their musical called 9. But then something odd happened. About 30 minutes into this interrogation, Daniel suddenly completely changed his story. The police were so caught off guard that they really didn't even interrupt. They just let him speak. One minute, Daniel was talking about this credit card fraud scam, and then the next minute, without missing a beat, Dan told detectives that, well, in fact, Friday afternoon had not been the last time he had seen Sam. In his new version of events, Dan told police that in the very early hours of Saturday, May 22nd, Sam had knocked on the door of Dan and Rachel's apartment. When Dan got out of bed and walked through his darkened living room and opened the door, he saw his friend standing in the doorway looking totally frantic and disheveled. Sam immediately told Dan that something horrible had just happened and that the two of them were in trouble and they needed to get the F out of there as soon as possible. Dan, who thought this must have something to do with their credit card scam, immediately stepped back into his apartment and, being careful not to wake up Rachel, put on his clothes. A few minutes later, he and Sam were driving Sam's car south to the Long Beach Town Center Mall where Sam had asked to be dropped off. And it was during that drive that Daniel heard exactly what the horrible thing was that had just happened. And it had nothing to do with a credit card scam. Sam went on to tell Dan that Julie was in his apartment and that he had killed her. Dan told police Sam's exact words. "I shot somebody. It was a fit of rage. I was doing some heavy drugs. I'm not happy about it, but she had it coming." The two detectives looked at each other. This was exactly the break in the case that they had been hoping for. Daniel's story had just confirmed their own reconstruction of the crime. Now they hoped that Dan could help them locate their killer, Sam. According to Dan, he had no idea where Sam was or where he was going, and that before they parted ways, before Sam got out at that mall, he had threatened Dan and told him that if he went to police and ratted him out, that Sam would come back and kill him, or he'd come back and he would kill his fiancée Rachel. And so when police had questioned Dan and Rachel the day after the murder had been discovered, Dan had panicked and lied to police in order to protect himself and his fiancée. He told police there was no man in a black hat, that he had made that up. At this point in the interrogation, Daniel was a wreck, and he just repeatedly apologized to police for misleading them. But despite Dan's sincerity, the police were now concerned that he might be hiding even more information about Sam, and so they decided to apply some pressure. At 11:43 p.m., about 1 hour into this interrogation, police asked Dan if he would give them permission to take a DNA swab. That way they could confirm that Dan was never present at the actual crime scene. Right away, Dan agreed. At this point, he was extremely eager to do anything he could to remove himself from the suspect list. As soon as the detective finished taking the swab out of Dan's mouth, the video camera inside of the interrogation room captures Dan's very obvious sense of relief. It was clear as he started to check his pockets and put his cup of coffee down on the floor that Dan thought this whole thing was over. The interview was over, he had done the swab, and now he could leave. But just seconds later, as the detective who had taken the DNA swab peeled off his gloves, the other detective asked Dan where exactly in Sam's apartment were police investigators likely to find Dan's DNA. Since Dan was a regular visitor in Sam's apartment, if they were going to use his DNA to rule him out as a suspect, they needed to know what Dan had already touched. And this question seemed to startle Dan. The camera footage showed him running his hands through his thick black hair, and for the first time, Dan looks kind of nervous, but he does tell police that they are likely to find his DNA in both the bathroom and perhaps out on the patio. Those are the two places he would go inside of Sam's apartment. After Dan says this, one of the detectives asks Dan point blank, "Did you see Julie's body inside of Sam's apartment?" Dan practically shouted that he had not, that all he knew about the murder was what Sam had told him in the car on the way to the mall that night. But the detectives, noticing that Daniel was really starting to fall apart and act nervous, they decided to ramp up the pressure by bluffing. Leaning forward towards Dan, who was now leaning back in his chair, one of the detectives asked Dan, "So, if you claim you were only in Sam's bathroom and patio, then why did we find your DNA inside of Sam's bedroom near Julie's body? Now, keep in mind, they had no way of knowing if his DNA was inside of that apartment. They wouldn't have known for weeks. But Dan didn't know that. He thinks what they're telling him is factual. And as soon as they said this to him, Daniel changed his story again. Looking totally defeated, Dan slumped down in his chair and he said, Okay, I'll tell you. This is what really happened. According to Dan, when Sam arrived at his apartment in the early morning hours of Saturday, May 22nd, and told Dan they needed to get the F out of there, before they got in the car and drove away, Sam had told Daniel what he had done and then took Daniel up to his apartment and actually showed him Julie's body. At this point in the interview, the cameras showed Dan back on his feet, pacing across the small windowless room. He's agitated and he's running his fingers through his hair. And for the next 3 hours, the two detectives pressed for more details about exactly what Dan had seen in Sam's bedroom. By 2 a.m. on Thursday, May 27th, Dan had been talking, yelling, and sometimes whispering to police for 4 straight hours. He was exhausted, and since he was getting married in now less than 48 hours, he was desperate to just wrap this up so he could go. So at 2:17 a.m., Daniel, who had been caught completely between a rock and a hard place, between trying to protect his friend or telling the cops everything he knew, seemed to crack. Yes, he finally shouted at detectives. Yes, I saw her goddamn body. Is that what you want to hear? I saw 2 gunshots in her head. Both detectives suddenly went completely still and looked at each other. They also looked up at the camera that was recording the interview and playing it live in an adjoining room where a third detective was watching it. All 3 detectives were thinking the exact same thing. Dan Wozniak had just given them a critical new piece of information. Based on what would stretch into a 14-hour interrogation of Daniel Wozniak and an investigation into the new evidence police would uncover based on what he told them, this is the reconstruction of what happened to 23-year-old Julie Kibuishi and how police were finally able to locate their prime suspect, Sam Her. Back on the evening of Friday, May 21st, about half an hour after Julie had left that Thai restaurant in Newport Beach where she was having dinner with her older brother Taka, Julie pulled into the parking lot next to the Camden Martinique apartments where she had agreed to meet her friend Sam Her. Although she was still wearing the sparkly tiara that her brother had just given her, Julie's mood had turned serious. Before heading into Sam's apartment, she scrolled one more time through the dozens of text messages he had sent her starting that afternoon. They all seemed so strange and out of character for Sam, but she knew Sam dealt with some very serious night terrors from his time in Afghanistan, and for all she knew, he could be having some sort of breakdown right now that was Afghanistan related. So, believing Sam really just needed a friend right now, she put her phone away, got out of her car, and made her way over to the stairs that would take her up to his apartment. When she reached the floor his apartment was on, she saw Daniel standing outside of it. It turned out Dan had become worried about Sam too when Sam had not been responding to his knocks on his door. Dan told Julie he did have a spare key and thought, maybe the two of them should just go inside and see what was going on. Grateful for the company, Julie waited a minute after Dan had unlocked the door and walked inside. Then she followed Dan into the apartment. There was no sign of Sam, but a few seconds later, Julie, who was standing in the front area of the apartment, she heard a terrified-sounding Dan call out from Sam's bedroom in the back of the apartment. She asked what was going on, and Dan just called out, "You'd better come in here. There's something in his bed that you need to see." And so Julie began walking towards the bedroom. Several hours earlier, Daniel had called Sam and asked him to go with him to one of the small community theaters where Dan often performed. It was called the Liberty Theater and was located about 30 minutes north of their apartment complex. Daniel needed help moving a heavy piece of set furniture that was wanted by another local community theater. Sam agreed, and the two met outside in the parking lot of their apartment building. Then they hopped into Sam's car and they headed north. Once they arrived, Dan led Sam through the empty theater, and when they were backstage, they climbed a flight of stairs to the second floor, and then once they were up there, Dan pointed out a dusty wooden ladder that led up to the attic. So up they went, and as soon as they were up there, Dan quickly walked over to this big piece of furniture and signaled to Sam that that was it. That was the piece they were going to move. Sam nodded and moved past Daniel and took up a spot next to him, kind of crouching down to get a good grip underneath this big piece of furniture. Little did Sam know that his friend, Daniel, who was now standing behind him, could not have cared less about moving furniture. Instead, Dan was quietly pulling out a .38 caliber semi-automatic pistol. And then once it was out, he aimed the pistol carefully at the back of Sam's head, and then he pulled the trigger. For a moment, all Dan could hear was the echo of the shot reverberating around the attic. And then Sam, who was still alive, turned to look up at his friend. Sam whispered, "I need help. I need help. Something hit me. I think I've been electrocuted." Looking directly into Sam Herr's eyes, Dan raised the pistol and pulled the trigger a second time. Except the weapon didn't fire. It jammed. So while Sam is laying there staring up at Daniel with a look of horror on his face, Daniel calmly pulled the slide back of the pistol. He cleared the jammed round out of the gun. He reloaded the gun and then placed the gun up against Sam's temple and pulled the trigger again. This time, the gun did fire, and this time Sam would die. Then Dan, stepping carefully to avoid the blood that was spreading out across the floor, bent over Sam's body and removed his phone, and rifling through his friend's wallet, Dan pulled out Sam's passport and Sam's ATM and credit cards. Flipping Sam's phone open, Dan began to send what would be a long string of text messages to Julie. Each one was carefully scripted to draw her to Sam's apartment later that night and to look to an outsider as though Sam was in the midst of a personal crisis and that he and Julie were somehow romantically involved. Leaving Sam's body where it had fallen, Dan climbed back down the wooden ladder, down the flight of stairs to the ground level, left the empty theater, and got into Sam's car. But before going back to his apartment, Dan picked up the 16-year-old Wesley Freilich, and they made their first withdrawal using Sam's ATM card. Once he had returned to the Camden Martinique apartments, Dan had just enough time to shower, change his clothes, and send Julie yet another round of strange text messages from Sam's phone. "I need to talk to you. Can you come here around midnight? Please, come alone, please." A little while later, when Dan arrived at the Hungry Artists Theater for the final showing of the play he was in called 9, this was not the same theater where hours earlier he had killed Sam, his fellow actors would report that Dan showed no sign of any stage jitters. Instead, he gave what some of his colleagues described as the best performance of his life, playing opposite his beautiful bride-to-be, Rachel Buffett. After the performance, Dan stood for a moment backstage by himself and checked Sam's phone. Once he saw that Julie had agreed to meet Sam at midnight, Dan smiled. Then he stepped back into the group of friends who were all congratulating him on his great performance. Then he and Rachel headed home, where Dan would shower yet again. He would have sex with Rachel, and then he would tell her he was stepping outside just to go for a little walk. In reality, he was making his way over to Sam's apartment to wait for Julie. At midnight, Julie arrived, and then when they both went inside and Dan went into the back bedroom and called out for Julie, Dan did, in fact, have something he wanted Julie to look at in the bed, but not because there was anything for her to actually see. Once Julie had walked into the bedroom and put her bag down and stood in front of the bed, not seeing anything on it, Daniel reached around her and pointed at the center of the bed and told her she needed to look closer to see what he was talking about. And so confused, Julie leaned forward, looking at the center of the bed where there was nothing. And as she did that, Dan pulled out the same pistol he'd used to kill Sam earlier in the day, and he aimed it at Julie, and he fired 2 shots into Julie's head, hitting her just below the tiara that was now tangled in her blood-soaked hair. Moving quickly, Dan arranged the scene as he would any other stage set. Using scissors he had brought with him, Dan cut through the waistband of Julie's jeans, pulling them down around her hips to make it look like she had been sexually assaulted. Then he took a black magic marker and wrote, "All yours, F.U." on the back of her sweater. Satisfied that he had created the perfect frame job that would have police chasing down Sam Herr as Julie's murderer, and knowing police would never find Sam, Dan backed away from Julie's mangled and bleeding body and returned to his own apartment, where he showered yet again. The next day, Dan returned to the Liberty Theater where he had killed Sam. This time, he brought an axe and that same pair of scissors with him. Returning to the attic, Dan used the scissors to cut off Sam's clothes, and he used the axe to dismember Sam's body. Dan left Sam's naked and headless body upstairs in the theater, but using plastic bags he had picked up at a nearby cafe, Dan packed up Sam's head and hands and one arm and stuffed them into a backpack. Then, Dan left the theater, drove to the El Dorado Nature Center 3 miles away, and there he scattered Sam's remains in shallow openings he found or dug near the bases of trees and under bushes. Then, Dan, who was so far behind on his rent he would soon be evicted from the Camden Martinique apartments, and who desperately needed money to pay for his upcoming honeymoon, headed for the ATMs where he would meet Wesley Freilich and collect another $400 installment of Sam Herr's combat pay. It is possible that Daniel might have gotten away with the brutal murders of Sam and Julie, but in those early morning hours of May 27th in the Costa Mesa police station, at about 2 a.m., when Dan was asked by detectives what specifically he had seen when he looked at Julie's body sprawled out on Sam's bed, Daniel Wozniak delivered exactly the wrong line. "I saw 2 gunshots in her head." All 3 of the police officers who were listening to that interview knew that anyone who was just looking at Julie's body, like Dan claimed he was doing, they would only have been able to tell there was a single wound. It would not have looked like 2 distinct gunshot wounds. So the only way Daniel could have known that there were 2 gunshots in Julie's head was if he had fired those shots himself. So when he still kept denying any involvement, the police told Dan they knew he was lying and they put him into a jail cell. They reminded him he was under arrest for being an accessory to murder, and the only way he'd be leaving is when he told them everything he really knew about Julie's murder. And then the following afternoon, at about 1:15 p.m., Dan would further implicate himself during a conversation he had from the jail with his fiancée Rachel Buffett. By then, Rachel knew Dan had been arrested. She had also found out from Dan's brother, Tim, that Dan had given Tim a backpack filled with bloody clothes and a .38 caliber pistol, Sam's passport, phone, wallet, and 2 spent shell casings. Instead of destroying the bag as Dan had told him to, Tim had just thrown the backpack over the fence behind their parents' house. When Rachel told Dan on the phone in a call that was recorded by police that she was going to tell the detectives what she knew, including the existence of this backpack, Dan whispered into the receiver, "Then I'm doomed." 30 minutes after this phone call with Rachel, Daniel would signal to police that he was ready to confess to what he did. The cameras show him sitting at a small table in the interrogation room, elbows on the table, head resting in his hands. Yes, he had murdered Sam because he wanted that $62,000 in combat pay that Sam had saved from his deployment to Afghanistan. And yes, he had murdered Julie just as a decoy, a way to mislead police into thinking that Sam had disappeared because Sam was not a war hero, but rather a killer who had gone on the run after murdering Julie in a fit of rage or jealousy. When asked by police why he did it, Daniel told them, "I'm crazy. It was always all about the money." Following Dan's confession, police searched the Liberty Theater and found Sam's badly decomposed partial remains. The only way to recognize the torso as belonging to Sam was the heart tattooed on his chest that was inscribed with the words Mom and Dad. On May 29th, the day Sam Herr would have turned 27 years old, police found his head, hands, and one of his arms scattered throughout El Dorado Nature Center. More than 5 years later, on December 16th, 2015, Daniel Wozniak was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. At the penalty hearing in September 2016, Daniel was sentenced to death. 3 years later, a separate jury found Dan Wozniak's ex-fiancée Rachel Buffett to be an accessory after the fact, after further investigation revealed that she had lied to police to cover up her possible involvement in the crime and to protect her then-fiancé Daniel Wozniak. As for the families of the victims, June Kibuishi wonders if she had taught her children, especially Julie, to be too kind. And for Steve Herr, the thought of his son's final moments will haunt him for the rest of his life.
On a Saturday afternoon in August of 2016, 43-year-old Philip Mackey dragged a ladder into his bathroom. Philip and his wife Marnie were working hard to fix up their home in Aberdeenshire, Scotland. And Philip, frankly, spent a lot of his weekends on these types of home improvement projects, so this was very typical. Philip carefully opened up the ladder in a corner of the bathroom and climbed up. Once he was up there, Marnie handed him a spray bottle that contained water and bleach, and then she stood back to supervise from the doorway. Philip sprayed the mixture liberally onto a cluster of mold that had grown in the corner of the room. It occurred to him that he probably should wear a face mask, but it was too late for that now. When Philip was done, he tossed the spray bottle back down to Marnie, who caught it in one hand, and then laughed at what an efficient home improvement team they had become. Philip checked his watch, and to his surprise, it was almost 5 p.m. He realized he needed to jump in the shower right away. Philip played saxophone and guitar for a local band on the weekends, and they had a show tonight. He needed to get going soon if he wanted to be on time. So he moved the ladder out of the way and turned on the shower. "15 minutes later, Philip toweled off and pulled some clothes out of his closet. He laid them out on the bed next to their cat, who was fast asleep in a tight little ball. As Philip threw his shirt on, he took a moment to look around his bedroom. The fresh coat of paint that he and Marnie had applied to the room only a week ago made the room look so polished. They'd also hung new curtains and bought a cozy feather comforter and down pillows for the bed, and so they were really starting to turn their house into a home. Philip was now running late, so he buttoned his shirt as fast as he could as he hurried down the stairs. But when he got to the landing and reached for his jacket, he had to pause to catch his breath. Philip could feel his heart pounding. It had been a while since he'd been to the gym, but he hadn't realized he was this out of shape. He felt a little embarrassed, but he didn't have time to dwell on it. Philip was in a hurry, so he grabbed his jacket and headed out the door. By the time Philip walked into the pub down the road, his pulse was back to normal and he felt okay. The band would play a great show, but by the end of the show, Philip was once again totally out of breath. And so he decided he would just need to get more exercise because he was too young to get this winded so easily. A few days later, Philip got home from work around 5 p.m. He tossed off his jacket and bounded up the stairs to his bedroom. But once again, he felt his heart start to pound about halfway up the stairs, and he had to stop to catch his breath. Marnie appeared at the top of the landing and asked if he was okay, and Philip just shook his head and said no. But then he kind of playfully told her that, hey, I'm just totally out of shape. But one morning, 2 weeks later, Philip's problems got worse. He was walking up the stairs very slowly, trying not to spill his cup of coffee, and he had only made it up to the third step when his vision became blurry and he suddenly felt very dizzy, and so Philip gripped the railing to keep from falling. Then Philip began to feel breathless, and so instinctively he just sat down and put his coffee down, and he hung his head between his knees for a few minutes until the dizziness passed. And then finally, when Philip was feeling normal again, but still just sitting there on the stairs, Philip was terrified, and so he rushed downstairs, he grabbed his phone, and he called the doctor to make an appointment. Later that week, Philip was sitting in his doctor's office. He had been coming to this general practitioner for years, and Philip trusted that he'd be able to help him. His doctor sat across from him on a stool, listening as Philip listed off his symptoms: shortness of breath, pounding heart, and dizzy spells. The doctor nodded and told Philip that he most likely had a lower respiratory infection. He said there'd been a virus going around recently, and a lot of his patients had chest congestion. He was going to run some blood tests as well, just to be sure it wasn't anything serious. But in the meantime, the doctor said he would put Philip on antibiotics for a few days, which should help Philip feel like himself again. Philip thanked the doctor and then drove straight to the pharmacy to pick up the antibiotics. And by the next afternoon, Philip was starting to feel like he had some energy again. Also, his blood tests had come back clean, and so it seemed like the antibiotics were working. But the following evening, Philip came home from work feeling absolutely exhausted. He'd barely moved all day at the office, and yet here he was, feeling like he was going to fall asleep standing up. Philip made his way to the stairs, and he leaned hard on the railing as he took the first 2 steps, but immediately he could tell his heart was racing. He went up another couple of steps, but it felt like he had just sprinted a mile, and so he stopped and bent over and began wheezing for air. Finally, he just sat down on the steps, and he leaned back on his elbows and did his best to try to take slow, even breaths. But even still, it just felt like there was this huge weight on his chest that was keeping him from breathing in fully. After a few minutes, Philip heard footsteps coming down the stairs, and he knew it was his wife Marnie coming to help him. And a moment later, he felt her hand on his back, and he let her guide him to his feet. Philip leaned heavily on Marnie's shoulder as they slowly walked up one step at a time. And then when Philip finally made it upstairs and lurched into the bedroom, he looked at the clock and he realized it had taken him 30 minutes to climb the stairs. But at this point, Philip was so exhausted that he just collapsed into the bed and asked his wife to close the curtains. He was going to attempt to sleep off whatever was going on with him. Over the next 10 days, Philip carefully took the course of antibiotics his doctor had prescribed him, but now it just didn't seem like they were doing anything. He was tired and dizzy at work. He barely had the energy to make it through his band sets every weekend. He was out of breath and exhausted basically all the time. But Philip kept hoping that he'd eventually just feel better, that he would just kind of sleep this off. One morning in October, so about 6 weeks after Philip had finished his course of antibiotics, Philip opened his eyes and immediately struggled to sit up. He rested for a moment on his back with his feet dangling off the edge of the bed, and then when he tried to sit up again, he realized that he genuinely couldn't do it. He did not have the strength just to sit up in bed. But he was feeling so defeated that he just rolled over and yelled out to his wife to please call his office and let them know he was not going to be able to come into work. Then Philip just closed his eyes and slept for the entire rest of the day. But later that night at around 2 a.m., so technically the next morning, Philip did finally wake up, but when he did, he again felt that intense pressure on his chest that made it hard to breathe. Except this time, the pressure was so intense, he literally felt like he was suffocating. And Philip's flailing woke up his wife, and as soon as she looked over and saw her husband was having this emergency, she reached for her phone to call the hospital. But right at that exact moment, Philip's lungs relaxed just enough to allow him to take in a full breath of air. And so suddenly he was calmed down for a second, and he just grabbed his wife's arm and he told her, "Don't call an ambulance." Marnie was caught off guard by his request, and so she flipped on the light and just stared at her husband, but she did put the phone down. And she would agree not to call an ambulance, but she told Philip they were done waiting whatever this was out, that he would, very soon, need to seek out medical help. Several weeks later, Philip sat in his longtime doctor's office feeling frustrated and exhausted as he waited for yet another set of x-rays of his chest. He was hoping that this time, the x-ray would actually show them why he was struggling to breathe. But this was the 4th appointment he'd made this month, and each time so far, the x-ray had come back looking totally normal. And without fail, his doctor would tell him that, hey, everything looks fine, and Philip would go home without any answers. Now, Philip trusted that his doctor knew what he was doing, but Philip was feeling extremely anxious and upset that his medical issues were still going undiagnosed. Philip was now spending most of his time in bed asleep. He had no energy, he hadn't been to work in over a month, and if he didn't get better, he would not be able to go back to work at all. And that would plunge him and Marnie into financial crisis. But that was just their financial situation. Philip also could feel his body literally breaking down. He was worried that eventually whatever was going on with him was going to kill him. Philip looked up when the door to the exam room opened, and he saw his doctor walk in, shaking his head solemnly. The doctor cleared his throat and told Philip that, once again, his x-ray looked totally normal. When Philip heard this, he just kind of snapped. Months of exhaustion and anxiety had finally bubbled up, and he just began to cry. He told his doctor that he just couldn't go on like this. The doctor sighed and nodded, agreeing that Philip was way too young to be in such dire health. The doctor was starting to suspect that Philip might need the advice of a specialist. There was a nearby clinic that specialized in urgent respiratory conditions, and the doctor promised he would call them ASAP. Philip thanked the doctor, but truthfully, he was skeptical about whether the specialist could actually help. But at the same time, he welcomed a new perspective because he was starting to give up hope. Later that day, Dr. Owen Dempsey opened up an email from Philip's general practitioner. Dr. Dempsey was a highly respected chest physician at BMI Albin Hospital, which was located only 30 minutes up the road from where Philip lived. Half an hour earlier, Philip's doctor had called Dr. Dempsey to tell him that, Philip was suffering from extreme shortness of breath and exhaustion and needed help right away. Dr. Dempsey clicked on the email attachment, which was Philip's x-ray, and it popped up on the screen. Dr. Dempsey looked it over carefully. For the most part, Philip had healthy-looking lungs. However, something strange immediately jumped out at the chest physician. He noticed that Philip's lungs appeared slightly gray, almost like someone had shaded them in with a pencil. Now, Dr. Dempsey could understand why Philip's doctor had said that everything looked normal. The grayness was actually so faint that at first, he actually thought it was a defect in the x-ray film. And so, Dr. Dempsey could clearly see why Philip's doctor had said the x-rays looked normal, because they basically did. But with Dr. Dempsey's deep knowledge of the human chest, he knew that Philip's lungs were not normal at all. The slight grayness in Philip's lungs indicated they were inflamed and that something was seriously wrong. So Dr. Dempsey decided to call Philip and see if he could figure out if anything in his environment or daily habits might be making him sick. Dr. Dempsey dialed Philip's number. After 3 rings, Philip answered, and Dr. Dempsey noticed right away that Philip was panting. Dr. Dempsey had lung cancer patients who sounded better than Philip. Philip explained that the reason he was currently so out of breath was because he walked through his house to answer the phone. That was it. Dr. Dempsey was shocked, but when he told Philip how surprised he was at Philip's shortness of breath, Philip just laughed and said he was surprised too. He said it was getting really hard to think of himself as a healthy person now that he needed half an hour just to climb his own stairs. Dr. Dempsey knew that Philip must be incredibly stressed out, and he appreciated that Philip was actually still finding ways to make light of his situation. But as desperately as Dr. Dempsey wanted to help Philip out, he really had no idea how to do it. Dr. Dempsey told Philip that he believed he could be suffering from a severe allergic reaction. Things people have in their homes, like black mold or pet dander, can trigger severe and sometimes dangerous allergic reactions. And other times, people can bring things into their home from a trip that ultimately triggers an allergy. For a moment, all Dr. Dempsey heard was just wheezing on the other end of the line. And then Philip spoke, and he told the doctor that, for the past few months, he'd barely gotten out of bed, so he certainly wasn't traveling anywhere, even within his own community. And Philip couldn't think of anything in his house that could have caused such a terrible reaction. He said there was nothing new, just the same pets they'd had for years. Now, Philip did mention that there was some mold in their bathroom, but he'd taken care of it months ago and it never came back. The doctor eventually just began to quiz Philip about potential ways he could have been exposed. And time and again, Philip shot each of them down. Even before he got sick, Philip didn't go to a health spa or other humid environments where mold could grow. He rarely went into his attic, which can also harbor mold. And since he'd gotten sick, they'd stopped remodeling the house, so he definitely was not exposing himself to any kind of home improvement chemicals. Philip said he didn't even smoke. And so by the time Dr. Dempsey had gone through his whole checklist of hazards and come up empty, he could tell Philip was close to tears. And Dr. Dempsey totally understood, because if he were in Philip's position, he would be just as scared and frustrated. Dr. Dempsey felt stumped. Nothing Philip had been exposed to recently sounded like cause for concern. So he asked Philip about the work he was doing on his house before he got sick. And Philip began describing all the painting and reupholstering they'd been doing. And in the background, Dr. Dempsey could hear Philip's wife, Marnie, reminding Philip about all sorts of other small projects they'd taken on over the past year. And at some point, Philip began rambling about his bedroom, something he was obviously very proud of. And he would tell Dr. Dempsey that they had really splurged on linen curtains and a brand new comforter. And right at that moment, as he was describing his bedroom, Dr. Dempsey had an epiphany. He suddenly understood what very likely was making Philip so sick. And so he cut Philip off and said, "How soon can you come in and get blood work done?" A few days later, Philip and Marnie sat in Dr. Dempsey's office as they went over the results of Philip's recent blood work. Dr. Dempsey smiled at them and reassured them that he did finally have a diagnosis. Dr. Dempsey explained that generally speaking, people do not suddenly become allergic to things that they're exposed to regularly, things like pets. And even if Philip did inhale that mold in the bathroom when he was doing those home renovations, his illness should have gone away when he was no longer exposed to the mold. But when Philip told Dr. Dempsey on that phone call that he and his wife were really excited about the changes they had made to their bedroom and they had splurged on the linens and the comforter on their bed, that is what tipped Dr. Dempsey off that potentially Philip could be suffering from a very specific and very rare disease. And it would turn out Dr. Dempsey's hunch was correct. Philip's blood tests had revealed that he was having a severe allergic reaction to bird feathers. This is known as hypersensitivity pneumonitis. But not feathers from a pet bird or birds in the yard. When Philip and Marnie redid their bedroom, they'd replaced their synthetic comforter and pillows with more expensive ones that were filled with feathers. Philip was allergic to the bed that he'd been laying in for months. That's why he kept getting sicker and sicker and sicker. The doctor explained that this very strange disease is quite rare, but it is so often triggered by people's bedding that medical professionals sometimes refer to this disease as feather duvet lung disease. Duvet is another word for comforter. Although Philip had never been bothered by feathers before, Dr. Dempsey told him that symptoms of hypersensitivity pneumonitis can develop quickly and worsen as time goes by. Without treatment, hypersensitivity pneumonitis can cause permanent damage to the lungs. But thankfully, Dr. Dempsey assured him that they had caught the disease in time. Dr. Dempsey prescribed Philip steroids, and Philip got rid of the feather comforter and pillows. Within 2 days, Philip was already feeling better. And within a few weeks, he was back at work and back to playing his saxophone in bars all across Scotland. And now for our second story, which is called Dying of Boredom. In December of 2019, 17-year-old Kyle Quitman took a deep breath of fresh air as a hospital volunteer wheeled him out the front door of a hospital in Queensland, Australia. Now, at the time, most of Kyle's friends were out celebrating the end of the school year. But Kyle had been in the hospital, having ankle reconstruction surgery to repair a really bad rugby injury. Kyle wished he could be at the beach right now with his friends, but after 3 days of being stuck inside the hospital, he was at least happy just to feel the sun on his skin. And it occurred to him that he really should try to enjoy this moment, because he was going to be mostly stuck inside for the next 3 months as his ankle healed, and while all his friends enjoyed the Australian summer that runs through February. The hospital volunteer parked Kyle's wheelchair on the curb and asked how his ankle was feeling. Kyle could feel it throb inside his cast, and he admitted that it was actually pretty tender. But a moment later, he saw his dad's car come around the corner, and suddenly he forgot all about the pain. All Kyle wanted was just to go home with his dad. Kyle's dad hopped out of the car and helped Kyle out of his wheelchair. Kyle's legs were a little shaky after 3 days on his back, but he leaned on his dad and managed to limp his way to the front passenger seat. Then off they went. The minute Kyle hobbled into his home, he could see that his mother had been carefully preparing for his arrival. She made the couch in the living room as inviting as possible, complete with fluffy pillows and his favorite blanket. There was a TV tray set up next to the couch with the TV remote, his gaming controllers, and a little bowl of candy sitting on it. Kyle smiled at all the amazing comforts his mother had assembled, but at the same time he sort of frowned because this was also where he knew he would be spending basically all of his time for the next 12 weeks, and as nice as it was, it felt pretty cramped. But in the end, Kyle just collapsed onto the couch, grabbed a controller, and started gaming. 4 days later, Kyle lay on the couch, a bowl of popcorn balancing on his stomach, as he listened to the family's pet cockatiel, Larry, repeat his name over and over again in a sing-song voice. Larry had a lot of personality, and Kyle loved to play with him. He had spent the morning trying to flick kernels across the living room and into Larry's cage. Kyle rolled a kernel in between his thumb and forefinger and then launched it across the room, And amazingly, it sailed right through the metal bars, right into the cage, and Kyle cheered as the cockatiel whistled his appreciation. But then Kyle sighed. Larry was amusing, but this had to be the most boring summer vacation of his life. A few of Kyle's friends had dropped by the night before with cookies and Gatorade, which was great, but then they all left for a party without Kyle, and he felt totally abandoned. In fact, the only person who spent any real time with him was his grandmother. She'd been coming over just about every single day to give Kyle cookies, and she would even play video games with him, but she was not good at video games. And Kyle really appreciated that, but again, he just felt totally bored and lonely. But perhaps the worst part of what Kyle was calling his, quote, couch arrest, was that he still had 77 more days of being stuck in here with nothing to do except wait for his ankle to heal. So, frustrated, Kyle grabbed another kernel and launched it into Larry's cage. A moment later, Kyle heard the garage door opening, and he knew that meant his mother was back with his 14-year-old brother, Dylan, and two of his friends. Within seconds, three 14-year-olds zoomed past Kyle as he sat there on the couch, and they raced out to the indoor pool that was separated from the living room by a sliding glass door. Kyle huffed and sarcastically called after them to have fun, but he didn't need to worry. All three teens jumped into the pool and began roughhousing, splashing water, and having a great time. Kyle's mom, Sherry, came into the living room right behind the kids, carrying a few grocery bags. As Dylan and his friends shouted and splashed around in the background, Kyle's mother told him that she was so sorry he couldn't be outside this summer. Then Kyle watched as his mother opened Larry the cockatiel's cage and set the bird on the floor for his daily walk around the living room. And as Larry began picking up popcorn kernels in his beak and marching around the room, Kyle, for the first time in his life, felt jealous of a bird. The next morning, Kyle's throat felt scratchy as he slowly came down the stairs from his bedroom. And when he coughed, he could feel phlegm coming up into his throat. As if Kyle didn't have enough problems, now he realized that he must have caught a cold from Dylan or one of his friends who came over the day before. But luckily, Kyle's mother was basically a mind reader, because moments later, she came rushing into the living room where Kyle was, and she set a few throat lozenges down next to him. She told him she'd had a cough too the week before, and she promised Kyle that his cold would likely clear up in just a day or two. 3 days later, in mid-December, Kyle was sitting on the couch as usual playing video games. He had just won a match in his favorite fighting game when he started coughing. But this time he was coughing really hard. He tried to steady his breathing, but he was hacking so much that he felt like he was fighting just to get air. Kyle wondered if maybe he was hunched over too much and kind of compressing his diaphragm. So he sat up for a minute and then just lay down on his back. But even then, he still couldn't get a full breath, and in fact, it felt like he had just run up a flight of stairs. Eventually, Kyle did get his breathing under control, but those few panicky minutes really rattled him. Later that afternoon, Kyle was laying on his back with Larry the cockatiel on his chest. Kyle was petting the bird when he felt himself struggling to breathe again. Larry fluttered to the ground as Kyle doubled over in another coughing fit. After a moment, Kyle heard footsteps coming swiftly toward the living room, and he knew his mom had heard him coughing. Moments later, Kyle's mom came flying into the room, and she put the back of her hand against Kyle's forehead, and she said he was burning up. She wondered aloud if Kyle maybe had an infection or some other complication from his surgery. Then she told Kyle that if he wasn't feeling better in the morning, they were going back to the hospital. And sure enough, by the following morning, Kyle was much worse. His stomach felt upset and his sheets were damp with sweat. His head was pounding so hard that he couldn't even open his eyes. He called out for his mom and cracked his eyelid just enough to see her come into the room. Kyle asked her for some aspirin, but Sherry thought he needed more help than that. She was going to stick to her guns and take him back to the hospital. About an hour later, Kyle laid back on the table in an examination room, his hands over his face to block the overhead light from hitting his super sensitive eyes. A doctor looked over Kyle's chart and asked if he had traveled recently or been exposed to anyone who was sick. Kyle scoffed at the idea he had been traveling anywhere and told the doctor that he hadn't left the house for 10 days. But Kyle had to admit he had been around some sick people. His brother had been out and about with friends constantly, and he had come home with a cough just last week. Kyle's mom also chimed in and said she too had a cough last week, and in fact, now that she thought about it, she'd had a cough on and off quite a bit lately. But Sherry assumed she must have gotten it from Kyle's grandmother, who'd had a cold for weeks, and she came over all the time to visit. The doctor nodded and said that it was possible that Kyle had caught the same bug that had made other family members sick. But for some reason, Kyle's symptoms seemed to be much worse than anyone else's. The doctor asked Kyle to sit up, and once he had, he pressed his stethoscope to Kyle's back. Kyle tried to breathe deeply, but he felt like there was rattling in his chest, and it was hard to fully fill his lungs with air. After listening for a minute, the doctor stepped back, frowning. He looked at Kyle, and then he looked over at Kyle's mother, and then he told them that he heard crackling in Kyle's lungs, which indicated he very likely had a fluid buildup in his chest. He told them this was extremely unusual, especially for a healthy 17-year-old with no history of respiratory issues. So whatever was making Kyle sick, it had to be serious. Kyle just stared at the doctor in disbelief, and then between his ragged breaths, he asked the doctor if he was going to be okay. The doctor told Kyle not to panic, but they would have to run a whole battery of tests to figure out what was going on with him. The doctor said it was possible that Kyle had an autoimmune disease like lupus. However, the doctor thought it was far more likely that Kyle was suffering from some kind of infection. So the doctor said he was going to send an occupational hygienist to the Quitman's home to see if there was something in their environment that was making Kyle sick. Meanwhile, Kyle would need to spend the night at the hospital for testing. As Kyle listened to the scary-sounding things the doctor was saying, he found it very difficult to stay calm. If there was something deadly hidden in the Quitman residence, he knew he'd been breathing it in for 24 hours a day, nonstop for over a week. And the rest of his family could also be in serious danger too. The next morning, Kyle woke up in his hospital bed, trying not to move for fear that he would set off another coughing fit. Even though he was exhausted, he couldn't sleep the night before. Between the intense pain in his chest and the fear of what might be wrong with him, it had been very hard to relax. As he watched the TV to distract himself, his doctor gently knocked on the door frame and came inside. He told Kyle that he had some good news and bad news. The good news was, so far, all of Kyle's tests had come back negative, which ruled out an autoimmune disorder and a host of other diseases. But the bad news was, the occupational hygienist had found some possible causes for what was making Kyle sick. There were traces of mold in the Quitman's house, and the hygienist was also concerned about the family's pet cockatiel, Larry. Birds could carry all sorts of diseases, and their feathers could also set off severe respiratory issues, like what was happening to Kyle right now. When Kyle heard this, he just put his hands over his face and he groaned. He had most likely been breathing in that mold around the clock, and Larry the cockatiel had been keeping him company the entire time. Kyle asked the doctor if they'd have to get rid of their beloved bird in order to get better. The doctor shrugged and said he couldn't be sure yet. To find out what was actually infecting Kyle's lungs, they would have to insert a tube into Kyle's lungs to take a sample of the fluids. The doctor told him that that procedure is called a bronchoalveolar lavage, and when he said that, Kyle's eyes widened. Any procedure with a name that complicated had to be painful. But the doctor smiled when he saw Kyle's reaction, and he reassured him that he'd be asleep for the whole 2-hour procedure and he wouldn't feel a thing. Kyle was relieved. Now he just hoped that this test would get him the answers that he needed. Later that day, Kyle was back in his hospital room, still a bit groggy from the anesthesia from the procedure. But when the doctor came in, Kyle was aware enough to notice the very serious look on his doctor's face. The doctor said that, once again, he had good news and bad news. He said the good news was they found what was making Kyle sick, but it was not mold or Larry the cockatiel. For a moment, Kyle felt really happy that his beloved pet would not have to be exiled from the family home. But then the doctor told him the bad news. Kyle's lungs were infected with a toxic bacteria called Mycobacterium intracellular, which can be extremely dangerous. If left untreated, it could permanently damage his breathing and even cause heart failure. Before Kyle could freak out, the doctor said he was pretty sure they'd caught it early enough to avoid any serious health damage for Kyle and his family. But the Quitmans would not be safe until the source of this bacteria was located, and so the hygienist was heading back to Kyle's house right now to collect more samples. The next morning, Kyle's entire family gathered around his hospital bed while the doctor went over the hygienist's findings. The air and water samples that the hygienist had collected confirmed that the danger was coming from an unexpected place: the Quitman's indoor pool. The pool water was full of the same bacteria doctors found in Kyle's lungs, and every time people splashed around in the water, they were inadvertently spreading the bacteria up into the air. Kyle had gotten sick because he had been breathing in the unsanitary pool water. Kyle and his family would soon learn that this bacteria had been growing in their pool for months, basically right after they had switched to a different filtration system. So the entire family had been breathing in this bacteria, but Kyle got much sicker than everybody else because he was laid up on the couch right next to the pool room for 2 weeks, just sitting there breathing in that filth day in and day out. Kyle's unusual condition is known as hot tub lung, since most people get it from breathing in humid hot tub water. Kyle's family immediately had their pool deep cleaned, and they also installed a new filtration system. And pretty quickly they all recovered and went back to their normal lives. But 2 years after the ordeal, the entire Quitman family went to a follow-up doctor's appointment and realized they had actually suffered permanent injury from their run-in with hot tub lung. Tests showed that all of their lungs now had a mild reduction in their ability to process poisonous carbon monoxide gas. It was a small but lingering reminder to make sure to always keep their pool nice and clean. From Ballen Studios and Wondery, this is Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, hosted by me, Mr. Ballen. A quick note about our stories: we use aliases sometimes because we don't know the names of the real people in the story, and also, in most cases, we can't know exactly what was said, but everything is based on a lot of research. And a reminder, the content in this episode is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. This episode was written by Aaron Lan. Our editor is Heather Dundas. Sound design is by Matthew Chaleli. Our managing producer is Sophia Martins, and our coordinating producer is Taylor Sniffen. Our senior producer is Alex Benedon. Our associate producers and researchers are Sarah Vitak and Tasia Palaconda. Fact-checking was done by Sheila Patterson. For Ballen Studios, our head of production is Zach Levitt. Script editing is by Scott Allen and Evan Allen. Our coordinating producer is Matub Zaire. Executive producers are myself, Mr. Ballen, and Nick Witters. For Wondery, our head of sound is Marcelino Villapando. Senior producers are Loredana Palavoda and Dave Schilling. Senior managing producer is Ryan Lohr. Our executive producers are Aaron O'Flaherty and Marshall Louis for Wondery.